Welcome once again to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're with us. Thanks for joining us today. We get to talk to Lawrence Eichen, and he's got a great story. He's an attorney, and we will stay away from the lawyer jokes, I mostly promise, but but you never know. And now, if you want to tell some, you can, Lawrence. I'll leave that to you. But he's got a great story. He's a negotiator. He's a speaker, and we get to talk about a lot of things, including imposter syndrome, which is something that I find pretty fascinating to learn more about. So we'll get to that. But Lawrence, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. Thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure, Michael. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, so let's start. And as I love to ask people to do, why don't we start by you maybe just telling a little bit about you growing up and all the things that younger Lawrence was.
Okay. Well, let's see. I grew up, I'm the youngest of four children. So I have three older sisters. I grew up in Rockland County, New York. So I'm still feel like a New Yorker more than somebody from New Jersey, even though I've lived in New Jersey probably for over 30 years now. And I grew up basically, I guess, typical stuff that you did as a kid back then was, you go to school, you come home, you put your books down and you go outside and you play sports. That's really what we did growing up. And I was lucky to grow up in a neighborhood where there was about 8 of us. And we played everything, every day and on the weekends, really, whatever sport, season was going on, we did it. And we made up our own games like all kids do. Basically, my childhood was, it was a little bit stressful at times because there was some real dysfunction in our family growing up. For the most part, I'd say it was a typical, middle class suburban family upbringing. School and sports was really what I did as a kid growing up.
As a kid, did you get to spend much time in the city? Did you guys go there very much? Did you go any games or just spend any time in the city?
No, I really didn't get into the city as a kid, really. Our family didn't do stuff like that. I didn't get in to see too many games. I grew up, I was a Knicks fan and a Rangers fan. I'm still a Rangers fan very much these days. I try not to be a Knicks fan. It's hard to watch the Knicks, but actually they're doing halfway decent this year. And I was a Mets fan, but I didn't really get into too much into the city as a kid growing up at all. So I was really more relegated to the television, watching sports. And just as a family, we never really went into New York City. So it wasn't until later on in my life, more college years and post-college years, that I took advantage of the city because we were only about 45-minute drive, without traffic. And you can get into New York City, which was, a phenomenal experience once I did eventually get into the city.
Could you take the train in?
Often I would take the train in. I actually eventually was working in the city at one part early in my pre-law career and used to commute by train into the city, which is not a fun experience for anybody who's a commuter into New York City, knows that.
Yeah, it can be a challenge, although I'm amazed that when we lived back in New Jersey and I would go into the World Trade Center and into the city, I would often meet people who came every day from Bucks County. A lot of the financial folks and so on would come from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and they had 2-hour train trips, and either they had discussion groups or cliques that communicated and spent all their time on the trains together, or people were in working groups and they did things on the train, but it was a way of life and they didn't seem to be bothered by 2 hours on the train each way at all.
It's funny, you do get into a routine. So I can identify with that because you become numb to it after a while. And back when I was doing it, and I'm sure a lot of people that you were talking about doing it, there were no, iPhones and, and iPods and things that are so convenient now to take advantage of, listening to a podcast and all this other stuff. You basically read the newspaper or you read a book. And you did, as you say, you get acclimated to it. And I kind of think of it as just becoming numb to it. But looking back, for me, it was sometime when I first commuted in, it was door to door about an hour and 45 minutes and both ways. And it really does take a toll after a while on you, because you realize, you're really spending a lot of time and energy commuting. And I didn't have like a group of people that I was commuting in. Maybe I would have enjoyed it more. I was just like your typical commuter, just taking a seat and trying to make the best of it. So for me, I don't miss it at all. I don't miss the commute into the city by train at all.
Yeah, I can understand that. I know for me, it was about an hour and 20 minutes door to door, unless there was a train delay. But I took a car from where we lived on Trails End Court in Westfield to the New Jersey Transit Station, which was part of the Raritan Valley line. Then we went into Newark to the PATH station, and then took the PATH train in. So it was broken up a little bit. But for me, again, as you said, iPhones were starting to exist a little bit, but not a lot. So I really didn't have access to a cell phone a lot when I was traveling into the city. So I did read a lot and spent a lot of time doing that, and I enjoyed it. But still, it was a lot of time that you couldn't spend doing other things. But with the fact that for me, it was broken up with a couple of trains and everything else, I guess, I survived it pretty well and can't complain a whole lot.
You're reminding me, I can remember commuting in 1986, and the Mets were in the World Series, and being on the train. And when I took the New Jersey Transit, there was no Midtown Direct from where I was taking it from. You had to go down to Hoboken and then catch the PATH train to the World Trade Center. And I can remember being on those commutes when the Mets were playing, and you could somebody had a radio, somebody on the commute had a transistor radio, and that would be the only way that you knew what was happening in the game. And like, you could almost, overhear what was going on by somebody else's radio. But it was just so interesting looking back now, how limited access was to immediate information that we take for granted today. There was no internet. There was, as I said, no iPhones, none of the stuff that exists today. But, like anything else, you just you didn't know what you were missing because you were just living it at the moment.
Yeah. And of course, the real question is, was that a blessing or a curse? And I'm not convinced either way on that, because we are so much into information and so much immediate gratification. Is that a good thing? And I think there are challenges with that too.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. Not to mention, it's very difficult to have a conversation, certainly with younger people that are glued to their phones like 99% of the time. It's like if you get somebody to make eye contact with you, it's almost like a moral victory sometimes. So I agree with you that the access to information can, get out of whack and out of balance. And I think there is a real loss, certainly in interpersonal communication, with people that are just looking at their phones down. They're looking down. You see pictures all the time. If you see photos or just even videos on the internet, you'll see a group of kids, walking home from school together. And there's like 20 kids all walking together, but every single kid is just looking down at their phone. There's no interaction between them. Or they're even at a sporting event, right? And you see people are like looking at their phones. They're not even watching the live sporting event that they're at. So there is something to be said for that.
Go figure. And, for me, I like to interact, although when I was traveling into the city, I just had a seat and my guide dog was there, and I read a lot. We weren't part of a group. But if anyone ever wanted to carry on a conversation, I was glad to do that as well. But I'm amazed, and I actually said it to somebody on one of our episodes of Unstoppable Mindset. I was amazed at how kids in the back of a car would be texting each other rather than carrying on a conversation. And this person said, well, the reason is they don't want their parents to know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
That in of itself is scary,
I can understand that. It is kind of funny. And
Yeah, it
texting,
is.
look, people text right in the house, right? You text somebody upstairs, downstairs. There is a lot. I will say, texting. There are some really amazing benefits of texting.
There are.
No, it's not. I'm not against technology and the advancement of technology. It's just, in the right place in the right time.
It's communication, and
Yeah.
that's an issue to deal with. Well, so where did you go to college?
I went to college, SUNY Albany, in the beautiful town of Albany, New York, which is really known for cold winters. So I can still remember walking home from the bars back then. The drinking age back then was 18. So when you went into college, it was legal to drink. And the bars would stay open till 4 a.m. And I can remember walking home when I lived off campus, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and literally just the inside of your nose freezing. Mm-hmm. The mucus lining of your nose would freeze on the way home. It was that cold and windy. So, I don't miss those cold winters, but college is a whole different story.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to be said for college. I've spent time up in Albany. We visited Lockheed Martin up there and some of the military facilities where we sold tape backup products. And I remember being at one facility and we were talking about security, and the guy we were talking to reached behind him and he pulled this hard disk drive off of a shelf and there was a hole in it. And so he said, "See this hole?" He said, "This is how we make sure that people can't read disks. We take disks that have died or that we want to get rid of all the data on, and we take them out in the back of the building and we use them for target practice. And the trick is to get a bullet to go through the whole drive."
That's funny. Yeah.
The things people do for entertainment, I'll tell you. Well, what did you do after college? I gather you didn't go straight into law.
No, I didn't actually. I started out as a computer programmer because my degree was in computer science. So I worked as a programmer for a few years, and then, long story short, is made some stupid decisions, quit my job when I really shouldn't have, and then did some other jobs in the computer field, like selling computer software. But I wasn't very happy doing that. And ultimately, that's when I decided to go back to school full time and go to law school. So I worked for about 4 years after college before I went back to law school.
Why law?
Hey, I'm still asking myself that question. Why law?
Well, yeah, there you go.
Really, it's one of those things. For me, it was one of my older sisters is an attorney, so I think there was that connection to law, and my aunt was a judge in New Jersey also, so there were some family, connections. I probably had some other cousins that were attorneys also, but I think honestly, for me, it was like I really didn't know what to do with myself. A friend of mine was studying to take the LSAT, which is the entrance exam to get into law school. Mm-hmm. And, I think I just thought to myself, you know what, maybe if I go to law school, I can sort of like salvage my career. I really didn't know what to do with myself. And I came to find out that many people that end up in law school really are ending up there because they don't know what else to do with themselves. I'm not that person that went to law school like with this dream from childhood to be a lawyer and all that. It was more like, I don't know what else to do. And it was a way for me to rationalize, well, maybe I can do something and still salvage a career. And so I just took the exam with the idea that, well, let me see how I do. If I do well on that, then I guess I'll apply. And if I apply, I'll see if I get in. So, one thing led to another. I did do well on the exam. And once I did well on the exam, I was kind of guaranteed to get into law school based on my score on the entry exam. And so I applied to a couple of places, got in, and then, then I ended up going to law school.
Where did you go?
I went to Rutgers Law School in New Jersey. And the reason it worked out for me was that by that time I had moved to New Jersey. And the reason I moved, coming full circle, had to do with the commute that I was doing into New York City, which was so long that I had decided, even before I was going into law school, I had decided to move closer down the train line so it wouldn't take me an hour and 45 minutes to get into the city. So I moved into New Jersey, and my commute into the city was like less than an hour at that point. And the fact that I was a resident of New Jersey allowed me to go to Rutgers, which was a very good law school, but it was a state school. So you could get a very good tuition and a good bang for your buck. And so that's why I chose Rutgers.
And besides, you wanted to root for the Scarlet Knights, right?
Well,
the poor Knights.
Yeah. Can't say that I was thinking that at the time. It's funny because I think of it as like, the Devils came into I think of it more like the Devils came into the New Jersey and started to win and won a Stanley Cup even before the Rangers did, which is really hard to swallow that pill. And when the Rangers did, I mean, the Rangers hadn't won a cup in like 50 some odd years, but then the Devils come in as an expansion team. And then I think they won 3 cups before the Rangers finally won a cup in 1994. But I was still, even though a New Jersey person, I was still always rooting for New York teams.
Well, yeah. And I rooted for the Knights just because they usually were doing so poorly. They needed all the support that they could get.
Yeah.
And I understand that. But one year they did pretty well, but they definitely have their challenges. And you mentioned the Knicks, and of course we are always rooting for the Lakers out here. And I'm spoiled. I like the sports teams I like for a weird reason, and it's the announcers. I learned baseball from Vince Scully and the Dodgers, and I still think that Vinny is the best that ever was in the business. Basketball I learned from Chick Hearn out here because he could describe so well and he really spoke fast. Other people like Johnny Most and some of the other announcers in the basketball world, but Chick was in a world by himself in a lot of ways, and so they both spoiled me. And then we had Dick Enberg, who did the Angels for a while and also did football. So I'm spoiled by announcers, although I do listen to some of the other announcers. I listen to occasionally Bob Uecker, who, is still doing baseball. Of course, I got to know him with the Miller Lite commercials. That was a lot of fun, but still I'm spoiled by announcers. And so I've gotten loyal to some of the teams because of the announcers they've had, and learned a lot about the game because the announcers that I kind of like to listen to really would help you learn the game if you spent time listening to them, which was always great.
Yeah, you've rattled off some real legends of the announcing world. Certainly Dick Enberg, even in the East Coast with New York and New Jersey, you got a lot of Dick Enberg just because he was a national guy. But I grew up really, to me, so you say, I think you said Vince Scully, you thought was the best in the business. To me, Marv Albert was the best in the business because I grew up with him doing Ranger games, doing Knick games. He was the voice of the Knicks and the Rangers.
Right.
And he was just great. And his voice is great. And so to me, he was like the guy, everybody always tried to imitate Marv
they
Albert.
do. And I remember listening to Marv Albert nationally, and he is good and was a good announcer, no question about it. Vinny was a different kind of an announcer because one of the things that I really enjoyed about him was when he, and originally it was Vince Scully and Jerry Doggett, and then Jerry died and some other people, Don Drysdale for a while, then partnered with Vinny. But when Vinny was doing a game, he did the first, the second, the fourth, fifth, and sixth, the eighth and the ninth innings, and then he was spelled by whoever his co-host was, if you will. But he did all of the announcing. It wasn't this constant byplay. So they really focused on the game. And I've always enjoyed that. It's amazing to listen to TV football announcers today because they're all yammering back and forth and plays can go by before they say anything about the game.
Yeah, there's a real art to that and the chemistry for sure. When you get a really good team and a really good broadcaster, actually what's coming to mind is I forgot his last name. He retired maybe 3 or 4 years ago from hockey. He was like the voice of they called him Doc. I forgot his last
I know who you mean. I don't remember his name.
Yeah, I forgot his name, but when he would do a hockey game, and you notice I'm always bringing things back to hockey because hockey's like my favorite sport, but when he would do a hockey game and you would only get him like if it was a national game, it was such a difference in the game because he was the best in the business, just the best.
Yeah.
And when he retired, like I said, maybe 3-4 years ago, I guess it's been, it was like a real hole, in the announcing business. Not that the other guys aren't good also, but he was just so great at it.
Yeah. Well, there are always those few, and it's pretty amazing. The fun one has, but even so, there's still nothing like going to a game. And I would take a radio when I'd go to a game, or now I probably would use an iPhone and listen to it on some channel, but still listening to the announcer, and also being at the game, there's just nothing like that.
Oh, yeah. By the way, here's the beauty of technology. Remember we were talking about technology, right? There's never a reason, I always say this, there's never a reason for two people to have a conversation where you're stuck not remembering anything anymore, right? Because, while you're talking, I'm just Googling who that announcer was, and it's Doc Emmerich was his last name, right? It was Mike Doc Emmerich, Mike Doc being his nickname. And, that's where technology is great, right? Because this is the way, usually when I get done playing, I play tennis during the winter, and after we play, we usually have a beer or sit around, and invariably the conversation turns to sports and you start talking about stuff, and nobody can remember anything, from 1970 or 80 or 90, it's like who won this or who was the most valuable player. And usually you sort of kind of say, no, can't remember. And then somebody remembers to look at their phone. And then next thing you know, the conversation continues because the information has been supplied. Whereas years ago, you just sort of had to leave the conversation. That was the way it is. Everything was left in the air. Nobody could remember. Now there's just no excuse for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of amazing the way it goes. When I go to family gatherings, there are always people looking at stuff on their phones, and there's discussion going on. And the bottom line is that people are talking about one thing or another, and somebody's verifying it or getting more information. And I can't complain about that. So that works out pretty well, and it's good to kind of have that. Well, for you, after going to college and going to Rutgers and so on, what kind of law did you decide to practice, since there are many different ones?
Yeah, when I first came out of law school, I went into personal injury law. I took a job as a defense attorney. It was known as being in-house counsel for an insurance company. Mm. And the reason I took that job is I always felt when I eventually went to law school, my mindset was I envisioned myself as being somebody who would go into court. So when you come out of law school, there's really a couple of different positions that you can get where you can get very good experience early on in your legal career. So for me, it was either going to a prosecutor's office, somewhere and prosecuting, or being a defense attorney and working as an in-house counsel for an insurance company, because there's just a volume of litigation in either way. I chose to go the route of the defense insurance position. I just didn't see I just never envisioned myself as a prosecutor for some reason. So I just never even explored that. So for me, it was really just a couple of choices, and that's the one that I chose. And it gave me the opportunity to just defend cases where if somebody either got into a car accident and you were sued by the other driver, as part of your insurance policy, you were entitled to a lawyer who would defend you. And so I was that guy that would take on the defense of cases where other people were being sued as a result of car accidents or slip and falls that might occur on a commercial property. I was also involved in those type of cases. And so let's say you were a contractor or something and you were sued for some kind of negligent condition on some property somewhere. Somebody fell, got injured, they sue everybody. Then your insurance entitled you to have an attorney defend. And I would do that as well. So that's really what I started out doing.
So that is the whole issue of defense is fascinating. Of course, what did your aunt, the judge, think of you going into defense, or did you ever get to talk with her about it?
No, actually, here's the thing. I really probably would have went a totally different direction in my career. Is that when I was in law school, I had a chance to work with a very prominent New Jersey defense attorney, criminal defense attorney. And I could have worked as his law clerk or intern, I can't remember, while I was still in law school. But the problem was he appeared regularly in front of my aunt, who was a judge. So there was this apparent conflict of interest. Not that I would, not that anything improper would occur, but my aunt was very concerned that how can she be in a courtroom deciding cases, even if I wasn't in the courtroom and he was the one in the courtroom, I was at his office. How could it happen? If somebody ever found out that I worked in his office, then there's this appearance of a conflict. So I couldn't take the position with him. And I really wanted to, because at that time, I found criminal defense very interesting. Just criminal law in itself is very interesting. The issues, evidence, and criminal procedure and all that stuff. So to answer your question or about what did my aunt say, it really was like not even a discussion about it. Just something that I chose to do and just went a totally different direction.
I'm fascinated by what's going on now with Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court. Are you keeping up with that whole thing?
Actually, I just read an article on that yesterday. So yes, and I am absolutely disgusted about what's going on. Even before that article came out about that. Talk about a conflict of interest. I mean, there's no ethical guideline apparently for the Supreme Court justices, like there is even for lower federal judges or federal people. Yeah, but Michael, here's the thing: there doesn't need to be in that particular. What I'm saying is, yes, it would be better if there was some real strict enforceable guidelines. I'm not against that. What I'm saying is, the judge himself should recognize just how ridiculously inappropriate that is. That's why even without actual laws, the judge himself ethically should be thinking, you know what? This probably doesn't look too good that I'm going on luxury, all paid vacations with one of the largest donors who's, a conservative minded individual. And now I'm ruling on cases that ostensibly might be certain areas of the law that are very favorable to these positions. Maybe I shouldn't be doing things like this because it looks like a conflict of interest. And that's the thing about the legal profession. There doesn't have to be an actual conflict of interest. It just has to be the appearance of a conflict of interest. And then it becomes unethical and inappropriate. So even if nothing nefarious was going on, because there's no proof of that, right? Nobody has any proof that it definitely happened. It doesn't even have to reach that level. It just has to reach the level of this doesn't look right. And for doing this for 20 years, right? Is that what I think I heard in the article? It's like it's been going on for 20 years.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting.
Well, what seems to me is even more interesting is he never reported it. And that's where I think it becomes even more of a striking dichotomy or paradox, if you will, because even if there's not a conflict of interest, even if he wanted to do it, why wouldn't he report it?
Well, that's what makes it even more revolting and disgusting.
That
he's sweeping it under the carpet. And why would you be sweeping it under the carpet? Like, what are you afraid to disclose?
I have grown up, especially as an adult, with a great respect for the law. I've been blind and a member of the National Federation of the Blind, which is the largest organization of blind consumers in the country. And the founder was a blind constitutional law scholar, Jacobus Tenbrook, who was very famous in the 50s and 60s for being an innovator with tort law and other kinds of things. And I've read a lot of his writings, and the law always fascinated me. And then I've been involved in working with Congress and working with state legislatures when, for example, we were trying to get insurance companies to insure blind and other persons with disabilities, because back in as late as the early 1980s, insurance companies wouldn't insure us. They said we're high risk, we have a greater and a higher mortality rate. And somebody finally asked the question, where's your evidence? Because you do everything based on actuarial statistics and evidentiary data. And they were told, well, it exists. Can we see it? Sure. Never appeared. Why? Because it never existed. They weren't doing decisions on persons with disabilities based on evidence and statistics. They were doing it based on prejudice. And so we did get to work with state and not so much the Congress, but state legislatures and the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And finally, now there's a law in every state. You can't discriminate. But it's just it always has fascinated me to be involved in the law in one way or another. And I've done it in other kinds of places as well and thoroughly enjoy it. But it is very frustrating when something comes along like this, where somebody's playing games that they don't need to play.
Yeah, it's, that's why honestly, without getting into much of a political conversation, because we could go down a rat hole.
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
I'll just say that's why people get so outraged when they see things that clearly show something's unfair, right? Or something is just inappropriate. It touches everybody's inner sense of what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
And when things look clearly inappropriate, clearly unfair, everybody gets incensed about it, or should get incensed about it, because we're all trying to we all seem to live with an internal compass of what's right, what's fair. You're born with that, Yeah. They did a study. I remember reading about this years and years ago, and I will butcher this a little bit, but I seem to recall there was a study on, like, I'm going to say 1-year-olds or 2-year-olds, something like that. And maybe he was even younger. I don't remember, but it was very infant or toddler type study. And all they were doing was like giving one infant or toddler like 3 balls, and then giving another one 2. And then, or they both start with 3 and then they take one away from the other one. And the whole study was just showing that even these babies or infants or toddlers who can't speak, they knew, they had this sense of something was not fair, and that's what the conclusion was. And again, I don't remember the study, but the idea is that it's just that it comes with each of us. It's like part of the hardware that you're wired with is a sense of fairness and justice, even at the earliest parts of your existence. And that's why when we see things as adults that are so unfair or inappropriate, it just triggers a natural reaction with us of, something should be done about this. This isn't right. And so that's where I'm coming from.
Well, for you did personal injury law. And how long did you do that? And then what did you do?
I did that probably at that particular place for about 2 or 3 years. After a while, you're like a hamster in a hamster wheel, because you have so many cases to handle at one time. And like, I remember a friend of mine once telling me, like, the good feel, like when you win a case as a defense attorney in that situation, it's not like you make any money for yourself, right? You're a salaried employee. So it's not like you feel good that you won the case. But a friend of mine, I'll never forget, he said to me, the good feeling only lasts until the time you get to your car in the parking lot. And then by the time you close the door and get into your car to drive back to the office, you start realizing about how many other cases you have to do tomorrow and the next day. And so you're like a hamster in a hamster wheel, because even if you resolve a case or settle a case, you get a couple of more the next day to replace the volume of cases that you have to always have. So it's sort of a little bit of a burnout, or can be, at least for me, it was. And so I went on I switched sides and went to a plaintiff's firm and did personal injury from the plaintiff's side, and also did some workers' compensation, and then got into some other areas like municipal court or minor criminal matters. So I did all that probably for about, I'm guessing, looking back, maybe 10 years in those areas of the law.
Then what did you do?
Oh, yeah. What did I do after that? Well, I took a
long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Yeah. I have an interesting story because I took a little turn after I worked in a firm for a lot of years. I really became disenchanted with practicing law, and I decided to try something completely different. And it's a long story, so I won't waste the time how I got into it, but I did end up becoming a financial advisor while I had my attorney's license, and became a financial advisor. And I worked for a couple of financial firms. One happens to be one of the largest ones that you would recognize their name. And I did that altogether probably for about, I'm going to say maybe 4 or 5 years. And I, even though I was relatively successful at that, I really became clear to me after not even that long. I realized this isn't really for me, but I was trying something different to see if I would just enjoy it more than practicing law. And so I didn't. And eventually then that's when I went and just decided to practice for myself and opened up a shingle and went back to practicing law. For me.
Was that more rewarding because you are now doing it for yourself? I would think so.
Yeah, it was. That's what somebody had suggested to me, that I should try that before I totally give up on the practice of law. So, and I would say that it is a lot better working for myself as an attorney than working for other attorneys. That I will definitely tell you is much better, because there is just the feeling that whatever you do is going to go into your own pocket, and being able to control your own time and all that stuff. I mean, there's added other stresses that come with working for yourself, for sure, that aren't there when you work for a firm or a company. But the trade-off for me was I didn't have to worry about anybody else telling me what to do, and I'll just figure it out and do it myself. And so it was sort of more of an entrepreneurial endeavor, working for yourself, than working for a firm or a company.
And I think you told me that you practice in Morristown.
I do practice in Morristown, New Jersey. Yes.
So did any of the dogs from the Seeing Eye ever come and say, we want to sue our trainers or anything like that?
No, but I do see those dogs routinely walking around. And in fact, I don't know if you've been there since they put up this statue.
I've heard about it.
Yeah, there's a statue right in the green, the center of town, of a Seeing Eye dog with somebody leading, the dog leading
Buddy, and who was the original Seeing Eye dog. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really nice statue, and it's definitely symbolic of that institution that is, world renowned and has done really great things with their.
Oh, it has.
Dogs,
absolutely. Yeah. It's the oldest guide dog school in the United States.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's been around since 1929, I think it is. So wow. It's getting closer to 100 years old.
Yeah, I've met people over the years when I used to have a Labradoodle, and we used to take it to a dog park in Morristown. And there have been times, I'd say I probably met 3 or 4 people over the years that had labs that they owned that had failed out of the Seeing Eye Institute, So, not every dog that goes to become a Seeing Eye dog makes the cut. And eventually these dogs, they're still phenomenal. The thing about it, the person that ends up getting that dog, gets a phenomenal pet, because the dog is probably better trained than any other dog around, but for some reason it didn't make the cut as a Seeing Eye dog. But I've met several other owners with their dogs that were what we used to say, the ones that didn't make the cut, but they were really beautiful dogs and very friendly. And
I don't know I don't know where the concept was created, but what I think we've all learned over the years is that the dogs that don't make it don't fail, because just not every dog is cut out to be a guide dog, or in specific case of seeing eye, a seeing eye dog. The generic term is guide dog, and seeing eye dogs are seeing eye because that's the brand of that school, but they don't fail. What they do is they get what people now call career change, which is appropriate because it's just not every dog is going to make it as a guide dog. In fact, the percentage is only about 50% make it, because the reality is there's a lot that goes into it, and it's an incredibly grueling and demanding process. So the ones that don't succeed at that oftentimes go find other jobs, or their other jobs are found for them. Some become breeders, but some go on to do other things as well, which is great. But you're right. Any of those dogs are phenomenally well trained and are a great addition wherever they go.
Yeah. I like the way I'm going to think of that from now on going forward, that it's career change for them. It's good.
So what kind of law did you start to practice, and do you practice now?
Well, I started to get more into, initially when I went into practice for myself, I did a lot more municipal court type cases and special civil part type cases. Municipal court meaning, minor, anything from like traffic tickets to DWIs. Those are all handled in the municipal courts in New Jersey. So that could also be like simple assaults, harassments, some temporary restraining orders, things of that nature. And special civil part cases are more like, matters that are like, typically people might know that as small claims court, matters that were traditionally $15,000 or less. Now they've raised the limit, but those are quicker cases, so you can get more volume. The idea for that for me was I could get my hands on a lot of cases, get some experience doing some new things. And I was never somebody who liked to have cases that lingered for years and years. And so I came from having a lot of cases that were in the file cabinet for 2-3 years. And it'd be like, I can't take looking at these cases anymore. So for me, I like, if I had a case, I have it for a couple of months and it's done. And then there's something fresh and new. So that just appealed to me. And municipal court work, what was nice about that is a whole different feel of that too, where you're just kind of going in, you're negotiating. Most of those cases are just resolved through negotiating. And so I was always a pretty good negotiator. And the idea was, it's sort of like a personality, or, just being able to develop a good relationship with a prosecutor, let's say, or the municipal court system. And so they're all different too. That's the other thing about municipal court, which is probably shouldn't be this way, but the reality is, every municipal court in each town, right? Every town basically has their own municipal court for the most part, until there was a lot of consolidation. But generally speaking, in New Jersey, most towns have their own municipal court. But you go into one town, it's a whole different feel than if you go to another town. And so it kind of kept things fresh in a way. It was like always new and different. The cases were always being new, relatively speaking, because they're turning them over a lot. So that's what I did for the most part. And then I got myself over the years into some other stuff, some commercial litigation matters, a couple of matrimonial things, and some guardianship matters, and a bunch of other stuff I'm probably forgetting, but for the most part, I was doing mostly municipal court work and special civil court work.
But you got involved somewhere along the line in resolution conflict and doing a lot more negotiating, which is a little bit outside regular law practice, but still a fascinating thing to get into.
Yeah, I did some work as a mediator, and I still volunteer actually as a mediator for Morris County. Most of those cases that I would handle these days on a volunteer basis is handling disputes that come out of the municipal court system, where sometimes you get these crazy fact patterns between neighbors. I'll give you a classic example. There'll be a lot of, the dog is barking, or one neighbor's parking in the spot of some other neighbor, or there's ex-girlfriends with the same boyfriend, and everybody's fighting, and there's harassment, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff that comes out of municipal court. And some of these cases, they kind of farm it out to mediation and say maybe this can be resolved through mediation and avoid going on to the main calendar. And so they give it a chance to resolve through mediation. And so I've done a lot of volunteer work in that regard, and just trying to help people resolve it amicably and be done with it, done with whatever the dispute is, and draft up some paperwork to make everybody stay accountable. And, so that's sort of like a give back that I've done, for the community, so to speak. And it's been rewarding in the sense that a lot of these disputes, even though they seem minor from the outside, if you think about it, and I think we've all been there, where you have a neighbor or a tenant or a roommate, then it's not going well. And it's incredibly stressful to live through those times when you got to come home every day, and it's either your roommate or your immediate neighbor upstairs, downstairs, or even across the street, or whatever the case may be. It's incredibly stressful to have to live through issues that are unresolved, that get on your nerves every day, right? It's hard enough to live your life working and raising kids and all that stuff that most people are doing. And then to have those added disputes lingering out there. So they may seem minor in nature, but when they're resolved, every single person feels a sigh of relief in those situations, because they can just get on with their life.
Do you find that you're able to be pretty successful at getting people to move on? And so you negotiate and you come to an agreement, and do people generally tend to stick with it? Or do you find that some people are just too obnoxious to do that?
No, actually, I've actually been very successful in that. At least the cases, I can't speak for anybody else who's doing it, but from my experience, I had been very successful. In fact, they used to refer the hardest cases to me because I had the reputation of being able to resolve these things. And so, yeah, I would say my track record in those disputes, I'd say, was very high to get people to resolve. Only a couple of times I can remember where it was just like, there was just no way this thing is going to get resolved. And we gave it a best shot. And they were going to have to go into court and just try to get it resolved that way. But most of the time, and over 90% of the time, they would actually resolve it. And what I would do is I would take the extra time to make it known to them that they're signing a document, that we're going to draft up, that is going to hold them accountable. Now, I think there was only one time that I had them sign off on a document that later on one of the parties violated it, and it had to come back to court for some other reason, for that reason. But most of the time, once they really go through the process and recognize that it's in their best interest to resolve it, it gets resolved, they sign off on it. And that whole process seems to work because they don't really break that promise. At least I never became aware of more than one case since I was doing it. And I did it, for 20 years. So it's a lot of times that I've done mediations. And I think there was only one case that came back after we resolved it.
You developed a process, I think you call it E equals MC5.
Yes, my formula for negotiation excellence. Yes.
What is that?
Actually, that is a formula that I came up with several years ago, really based on my experience negotiating. And I designed it and modeled it after Einstein's theory of relativity, right? Which is E equal MC squared.
You physics guy, you.
No, I'm not a physics guy. I'm not a physics. I was a math. I did like math. I did like math for sure. And that's why I went into computer science, actually, probably because it's the same logic, in solving problems. But physics, even though it's interesting, was never my thing. But I did remember that formula. It did stick in my head for some reason. And when I used to talk about negotiating and just, talking to other people about it, clients, other attorneys, whatever, you get into these conversations, I realized that I had a lot of the same initials as the Einstein formula. And so I thought, you know what, I think I can make this work by coming up with something simple to that's memorable. And so E equal MC to the fifth is really, the E stands for excellence, with the idea in order to get the results we're shooting for, right? We're shooting for excellence. Okay, so that's the thing. We're shooting for getting excellent results, but we're shooting to get excellent results on a consistent basis, because the idea is anybody can show up and get an excellent result once in a while. And I've done that many times. I'll show up into court, I'll get an excellent result. It's not because I was doing anything fantastic. It's just I happened to ask for something, and the prosecutor or the other attorney or the judge granted whatever I was asking for. It wasn't because of anything great I did or any kind of great negotiating I did. So you can get excellent results once in a while. Anybody can do that. It's about getting it on a consistent basis. And that's what the formula is really designed for, because the M in the formula stands for mastering. And we're going to master the 5 C core components. And those 5 C's stand for commitment, confidence, courage, compassion, and calmness. And those 5 core components, all starting with the letter C, if you can master those 5, you will get exponential results. That's the idea of having it to the 5th power. You get exponential negotiating results, because if you think about it, if you're negotiating in front of somebody and you sit down at a table or conference room or wherever, the hallway or on the phone, and if you have a mindset where you are committed to your position, right? You're confident, you have the courage to ask for what you need to ask, because sometimes it does take courage to ask for things. And you have compassion, meaning whoever you're negotiating with, right? They could say whatever they want. They can be obnoxious to you. They can be insulting. It doesn't matter. You're going to stay in a position of compassion, and you can be calm as you're handling objections and pushback. If you have all 5 of those things working for you, just imagine your mindset when you're negotiating. You're going to get excellent negotiating results. Yeah. And so that formula is something that I talk about when I give presentations on mastering the art of negotiating. And I apply that formula. I go through each of those components, obviously, in more detail, and give examples and strategies and tips how to improve in each of those particular areas. And again, the concept is by mastering them, and you don't even have to master all 5 to see dramatic results. If you just, master 1 or 2 of those and improve a little bit on the other ones, you'll see tremendous results. So you don't have to master all 5, but the goal would be to be mastering all 5 of those. And then you really see excellent results on a consistent basis. That's where that formula is.
And I would think, to a large degree, calmness, as you point out, is not only one of those, but would probably, in a sense, be the most important, to get some of the emotions to die down and get to really look at what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And, I fluctuate between which one is the most important, but the reality is, they're all important.
Yeah.
But being calm, absolutely, there's times in a negotiating situation where calmness is so effective, because especially when you're negotiating and, you don't want the other side to, see you getting all anxious and nervous and stressed out, right? You want to be calm, just because you don't want to tip your own hand necessarily, right, but also you don't want to fuel a potentially explosive or volatile situation, depending on what you're negotiating about, right? Because we negotiate about all different things, and we could be negotiating, as I was talking about earlier, about disputes between neighbors. Those are certainly highly charged, very emotional. There's a lot of resentment and bitterness and anger in a lot of those type of disputes. Or you could just be negotiating on a very, straightforward contract dispute, not maybe so emotionally charged, but there's a lot of money involved, and you want to be calm when somebody's saying no or giving objections. You might be thinking internally, oh my God, I really need this to settle. I need this deal. I need to close this deal. But you don't want to let that on. You want to be able to. So it's sort of like playing poker, right? When you have a great hand, you don't want to let it on. When you don't have a great hand, you don't want to tip your hand either. You need to be calm at all times. And so to your point, yes, calmness is very effective. I like to think of calmness as a trait of leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're calm, when you're negotiating, I always like to say that oftentimes, whether you're negotiating with a client, a customer, your spouse, business owner, anybody that you're negotiating with, many times during a negotiation, the other side needs to be led to the conclusion that you want them to reach.
Yeah.
So being calm is a position of leadership. And if you have very good points to make, and you have a lot of good reasons why whatever they're objecting to, your position meets those objections, when you're calm, you're going to be way more effective in presenting your side, and you're going to simultaneously allay their fears and their concerns that they're raising with their objections by your calmness. It's an energy that if they see you not being all stressed out and bent out of shape about their position, and you're really calm and effective in presenting yours, it can help persuade them into arriving at the conclusion where you're already at. So it's leadership. That's why objections are really an opportunity for you to be a leader. It's an opportunity for you to lead that person back to where you want them to go. And it's like sports, right? Who do you want taking the last shot of the game? You want the guy who's going to be calm under pressure, not the person who's going to be reacting and stressing out so much.
One of the things that you talk about, I know, and you mentioned to me, is the whole idea and the whole issue of imposter syndrome. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Imposter syndrome is a very interesting issue. I definitely relate to it personally because I've felt imposter syndrome for so many years in my legal career. And first of all, what it is, if anybody who's listening or watching is not familiar with it, it's basically this fear of being exposed that you're a fraud or you're an imposter. And hand in hand with that is usually this fear that you're going to be found out to be not as competent or not as qualified as other people think you are. So that's where this concept of being an imposter, right? And a lot of what goes with imposter syndrome, so for somebody who's experiencing it, is that they tend to attribute their successes, their achievements to external factors rather than owning their own achievements. And what do I mean by that? Like external factors, that could be like luck or chance. Somebody might get a great result and they might just attribute that success to, well, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time, or I just had the right connection. I knew the right person. And when they say things like that to themselves, they're really disowning their own skills, their own qualifications, and they're attributing this success to something external from themselves. And that external factor is not just luck or chance. It could also be, their personality, their charm. For me, I can share an example. When I used to go into court and get a great result, sometimes driving home in the car or driving back to the office, I should say, I'm replaying what went on. And I'm thinking, I got the result because I was personable. I was making the judge laugh a little bit that day. I was, I was diminishing my own skill or my own competency. And I was kind of thinking the reason I got the result was probably because he liked me more than the preparation I did, more than the arguments that I made. And that's a classic example of like diminishing your own skills and attributing your success to that personality or charm. And you can extend that to gender, race, ethnicity, age, even handicap. Why is somebody in the position they are in? Why did they get the results? Well, maybe it's because, let's say for women, very common, women might think, well, I only got this high profile position because there's no other women in the company that are in these high profile positions. So even though the woman might be completely qualified and skilled and competent, she might be thinking to herself, if she's dealing with imposter syndrome type issues, she might be thinking the only reason I got it was because I'm a female, I'm a woman. And it had nothing to do with my skills and competencies. And so again, it's externalizing our own successes and attributing them to external factors. That's just what it is. That's sort of the definition of imposter syndrome.
So it sounds like you've had to deal with it some, because you just talked about it when you're driving back from a trial and so on. So is it something that you have had to contend with?
Yeah, many times. It started with me, honestly, when I was in law school. I didn't, and here's the thing, I didn't know it was called imposter syndrome. So I only found that out maybe, I don't remember when, maybe 5-10 years ago, I'm guessing, but I never heard of that. But I had the symptoms of this stuff without knowing what it was. But when I was in law school, the first way I used to feel like an imposter was because I was a computer programmer, right? And so I was really a programmer. And now I was in law school with all these law students who in my mind chose to be there because they wanted to be lawyers. I'm in here thinking, I didn't know what else to do with myself. I'm really a programmer. I'm not really a person who reads books and studies like that. I'm a programmer. So I started to feel that in law school. And then when I was practicing law, even having graduated from law school and passing the bar and being qualified to be a lawyer, now when I was in court very early on in my career, I'm worried when I'm in front of a judge, like he's going to ask me questions and I don't know the answers to them, and I'm going to look foolish and stupid and not smart enough. And it was like kind of bringing back childhood stuff because my father used to make me feel that way. And it was like, oh my God, now I'm in front of all these older men that are going to be quizzing me and making me feel like I don't know anything. So there was that fear, like I was going to be found out. That's that feeling like, oh my God, I'm fooling everybody. That's part of imposter syndrome. It's like you feel like you're fooling everybody. And so I was always believing I was getting away with it when I would go to court, even though I got good results. Those results weren't being owned by me the way I was describing earlier. They were really being attributed to external factors. So I'm just going along all the time believing that I'm this, imposter. I'm not really a lawyer. So like when I would be negotiating with prosecutors and other attorneys that had more experience than me, I'm on guard thinking, oh my God, I'm going to look so foolish and somebody's going to finally go, aha. You're not really a lawyer. What are you doing here? You're a programmer, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Like, of course, that would never happen. But I'm thinking in my head, like, there's this feeling like I'm going to be exposed. So, yeah, to answer your question, definitely experienced it a long time without knowing what it really was.
Do you regard it as a mental disorder?
No, not at all. Actually, imposter syndrome is not a mental disorder. It's not like in the DSM, which is that diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. So it's not in that. It's really a phenomenon is really what it is. In fact, it used to be, it still is, in many parts of the world, it's known as imposter phenomenon. That's how it first, that was the phrase that was first coined, was imposter phenomenon. It's more commonly known as imposter syndrome now. But it's not a disorder, really. It's really in the dictionary. If you looked under like syndrome, right? There's a definition of syndrome. One of the definitions is, I'm pulling it up actually, is it's a set of concurrent things such as emotions or actions that usually form an identifiable pattern. That's like under the definition of syndrome.
Right.
And there's other definitions for syndrome, but it's that particular definition of syndrome that's really what imposter syndrome is. It's like patterns. There's identifiable patterns of emotions or actions that become this phenomenon that I'm talking about.
How did you defeat it?
That's a great question.
I'm assuming you defeated it.
Well, you know what? Here's the thing about defeating it. When I talk about defeating imposter syndrome, yes, I feel like I've defeated it, but I kind of think of it as sort of a rash that comes up every once in a while. And now I have the ointment that I need to put on the rash to get rid of it, right? So it is not unusual for imposter syndrome to still sort of manifest at times in various stages of somebody's career, because a lot of times people, as they continue to go through their careers, they're taking on new challenges, new risks, new positions, new things that they've never done before. And that's often the way imposter syndrome can be triggered, because all of a sudden now there's a lot of doubt, right, about what they're doing because they've never done it before. So the very first thing I'd like to say about defeating it is that, yes, I feel like I've defeated it, but I also recognize that it's not unusual for this to maybe show up from time to time. And when it does, the key now is I recognize it for what it is. I'm not this imposter, right? I'm not this fraud. I'm not this incompetent person, or not skilled or not talented or not smart enough, let's say, type of individual. It just might mean that I don't get the result that I wanted to get maybe at the moment, because I could fail at something or make a lot of mistakes at something. That doesn't mean that I'm an imposter. There's a big difference between what I would call typical self-doubt and typical failure or making mistakes along the way. That's just part of being, in life and being in business. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fail. People do it all the time. Most successful people you'll ever speak to have failed many times along the way. So the difference is, it's one thing to fail and not get the result you want. It's quite another thing to think when you fail, you're an imposter, right? So that's the part that I've defeated. I no longer think I'm an imposter. I might get feelings of self-doubt still, and I might start to feel again like, I wonder if I'm really trying to, pull the wool over people's eyes here. So I might start to go down that rabbit hole or rat hole of feeling like an imposter. But as soon as I do these days, I recognize, this is just my imposter syndrome kicking in. And then I just understand what it is. And then I can, rethink it. That's the way to defeat it, just to set the stage, if you want to talk a little bit about how to defeat it. But just to give you that framework, it's defeatable. Yes, I do feel like I've defeated it, but I also know, and I'm humble enough to know that it can still pop up, and when it does, I just have to recognize it now for what it is. And as I say, now it's like just going in and having the ointment and putting it on and be done with it.
It's all about changing mindset.
One of the ways, is very instrumental in defeating it is rethinking it, reframing issues to yourself. For example, I was just talking about, feeling like you're faking out people, right? I used to feel that way, where I would feel like, I'd go through a negotiation in court. I'd come out of the courthouse and I'd think, oh my God, I got away with it. I faked them out again. I pulled the wool over either the other attorney or the judge, whatever the case may be. So that's how it would start out. I lost my train of thought. Wait, what did you just ask me?
I said it's very well. I said it's all about, but it's in large part changing a mindset.
Right, changing it. Thank you. So yes, so the idea is, instead of the mindset of faking and fooling, that's why I was bringing up this example, right? Instead of like me thinking I fooled them, right? It's just thinking and retraining. Well, look how well I handled that. Yeah. Right. Look how well I handled that, as opposed to look how I fooled everybody, right? Or, reframing things where you think like you're not qualified or skilled. It's rethinking and going in and remembering, what are all these other things that I've done that used my skills and used my talents? And one of the ways to do this is to really take the time to reflect and journal out, what are all the skills you have? What are all the achievements you've made? What are all the successes you've had? And by writing out a list of your accomplishments, you're allowing yourself to do a few things. One is to own them, to really own these achievements, not just writing them out and not owning it, but writing it out. There is some time involved and some effort that needs to be spent to own your achievements and own your successes, and writing them out by hand. I recommend doing it by hand because there's something that happens transformative when we write things out by hand. That extra time it takes allows you to really own it. And so that's one of the ways, is just to write out your list of achievements. It's a reminder to yourself that you do have these skills, you do have these talents, you are competent. Because remember, this is the thing about imposter syndrome. It's not true, right? I mean, you're not a fraud and you're not an imposter. So that's the good news, right? It's not your truth. The key here is that we are taking what I believe is a false belief within ourselves, and we're taking that to be our truth. We're accepting that to be our truth, rather than recognizing that, the real truth of ourselves is that we do have these skills, we do have these talents, we do have these qualifications. And, if something is false or true, it doesn't matter. What only matters is if you believe it to be true.
Yeah.
So if you have false beliefs about yourself that are triggering imposter syndrome-like feelings of feeling like a fraud or an imposter, what you're doing is you're taking the false beliefs and you're believing them to be true. So to get back to your initial point about it's all about the mental mindset, it is, because as we think, so we are, so to speak, right? So it's rethinking the messaging, the internal messaging that we're allowing ourselves to have on a regular basis. It's rethinking it. It's retraining our minds to have a different thought about ourselves or about situations, because oftentimes imposter syndrome is triggered by situations. For example, I'm not walking around when I was dealing with a lot of imposter syndrome feeling like an imposter. It's when I would get into court that it would be triggered, or when I would get in front of a more senior attorney in the law firm where I used to work at, and I didn't want to have any questions about what am I doing or what was the case about, because I would be, I'm going to be exposed if I don't know something or if I make a mistake. So it was certain situations that would trigger it for me. It's reframing and rethinking those situations that can lead to the triggering of it. And that is, to your point, is getting the mental mindset in the right place in order to deal with it. And I just want to add one other quick thing, is that not only did I personally work on rethinking the mental thoughts, but I also did what I call excavating, because a lot of the feelings that are associated with imposter syndrome, a lot of the thoughts that we get, in my personal case, stemmed from decades and decades ago, right? From childhood and, young adult life. And so what I did, because I'm a big fan on self-discovery, I did a lot of excavating and reflecting and going deep inside myself to figure out, where did these come from? Where do these thoughts really coming from? Why am I giving myself these messages? And then working through some of those more difficult, uncomfortable, and even painful, issues, to sort of liberate myself from being tied down to those, what I would call unhealthy or dysfunctional messages within myself. So it's not just rethinking on the surface, which is definitely important and helpful. It's, if necessary, excavating and going deeper within yourself to get to those core fundamental building blocks of where that programming came from. And that's some of the harder work that needs to be done. Sometimes, may not be in everybody's case, but in my case, it was necessary for me to really bring it to the surface, crystallize it, examine it, and then come to a conclusion like that's no longer appropriate. no longer makes sense in light of all the evidence and data that I've accumulated during the course of my career.
And it makes you a better person by any definition, which is great. Well, I want to thank you for that explanation and for all the time that we got to spend today. This has been absolutely fun. If people want to reach out to you, perhaps to talk to you about being a speaker or any of the other things, how do they do that?
Well, first, let me say I've enjoyed this too, and thank you for the time as well.
I told you we'd have fun.
Yeah, no, it was very enjoyable. I think we could have talked even longer, and I know
we could have. We could do it again.
Okay. So they can reach me really two ways. The simplest way is email, obviously, is Lawrence, my first name, which is Lawrence, as you see on the screen, at firstclassspeaking.com. So Lawrence at firstclassspeaking.com is email. And they can reach me by phone at 973-539-2831. And I speak both on imposter syndrome and also on negotiation, as we talked about a little earlier as well.
Super. Well, I hope people will reach out. I think that you have said a lot of things that resonate and that I find fascinating and resonate with me as relevant, that we all really need to consider. And I want to thank you again for doing it. And I hope you're listening out there really enjoyed this. We really appreciate your time. I ask that you give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to us, and love to have you do it on iTunes and so on, but please give us a 5-star rating. We appreciate that. Love to hear your comments. You can email me, Michael, Michaelhi, at accessibe.com, or go to our website, michaelhingson, hingson.com/podcast. If you know of anyone else who want to be a guest, and Lawrence, you as well, if you can think of anyone else that we ought to have as a guest, I would really appreciate hearing from you and appreciate any introductions. We love it. Really appreciate you all being here, and Lawrence, especially you. So thank you once again for all of your time today.
Well, Michael, you're very welcome, and thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.